Hi, my name is Robert Moult. I'm an assistant librarian at Wynberg Library. I'm almost at the end of my stretch of my career in the library service. I have been in Wynberg Library more longer than any other branch I've been. I've been over 10 years at Wynberg Library. I've been in two stretches from about, I think it was around about August 1983 to roughly the end of 1986. Yes, it was New Year's Eve 1986, I remember, then I moved. And the stretch from middle of January 2011 to the present day, that have been my stretches here. That's my experience of Wynberg Library, but Wynberg as a suburb goes a little bit further back, quite a lot back, roughly around 1970. We immigrated from Great Britain. It's one of the countries that actually calls itself great, officially. Anyway, jokes aside, I moved into Kirstenhof, which was a new place in those days. And the interesting thing was that we used to do some shopping in certain, down what we call the southern suburbs, like Plumstead, Bergfleet. But Wynberg was and of course Claremont. Wynberg was a very bustling place. The main road area of Wynberg was very bustling. And there were some really fancied shops in those days. The most famous one being Hinshelwood's. That was a very well-known shop in that area. It was old. Even then in 1970 it was old. But Wynberg had the feeling you were in the premier suburb of the South Peninsula, southern suburbs area. You were more so than what Claremont is now. And it's fascinating when you look at the Wynberg station, and it was the premier station at the time. Look at it now, but we'll get back to that later. So Wynberg was a place of importance. I remember we used to travel a bit to Wynberg. The first thing I remember, there was down Church Street or Church Road towards the courts. There was a church or thing with a Reverend A. Hitler. Yes, as a child, but Hitler was spelt differently, Hitler, which apparently is actually how you actually meant to spell it. So I read. And I used to comment on this because being fascinated in history, and World War II was very big with my parents because they experienced that awful war. And Mr. Hitler was a huge, bad factor for my parents. So it was kind of strange. I don't know whether it's a child's impression that such a man actually existed, but if anyone would know such a man did exist in Wynberg, that I'll be quite interested. No, but it was my impression of Wynberg on the Church Road area. And of course the Maynardville Park. My father did some work for the council in those days, and they used to have a Christmas party sometime in December. And I remember going to the Maynardville Park twice for that, in 1970 and 71 for the park. And of course there was the Community Chess Carnival, which in those days was, they sort of, I don't know if they still do that now because I haven't been for years, but in those days other communities used to put out stalls. The Dutch would have their stall, so you got what is known as oliebollen, which is, if you're a Dutch, you'll know what that is, kind of a very oily but very delicious donut with raisins in, with caster sugar thrown over it. Lovely thing. And then of course there was the Italians. Where would food be without the Italians? There was an Italian section, and of course there was a Greek section, which I remember because people used to smash plates. So it makes an impression on one when you're about 12 years old. And there were lots of kind of things like that. So it was very, very, it was Polish. I think there was a Polish store because there was a considerable Polish community in Cape Town. I know my father worked with a couple of Poles in his department, which was quite interesting. But Wynberg, because Maynardville is a famous park, anyone who Helen Robinson's work will know what a fascinating area is. And the first thing you get to know about Wynberg is the architecture of the suburb. It is unlike really any other suburb in this area. It's very different. You get up on the hillside, you get really colonial, very nice buildings. And then you go below the railway line where you get some really exquisite old South African homes. And from an architectural point of view, Wynberg is a really interesting place and kind of made an impression on me at the time. I remember we used to go to the cinemas there. I remember seeing Saturday Night Fever at the appropriate Capitol, which suited the venue suited the film. There was no one over 30 watching that film. I remember when I went to see it. I was about 19 at the time, and yeah, I saw a few films there. I remember Aces High or something like that. The Capitol. Capitol was was being derogatorily called as a bug house, but it was actually quite a nice place. I liked it quite a lot. And then it was the very more fancy and had a spectacular CinemaScope screen at the Ster Constantia, which is now where the Riverstone Mall is, which is a sad relic of what that cinema was. I remember seeing Heaven's Gate, a notorious film because it brought down United Artists there. It was one of my favourite films because it's an absolutely beautiful film. And I was knocked out by it simply because of the CinemaScope screen of the Ster Constantia, because that film is meant to be shown on big screen. And wow, that was something I'll never forget. That was, even though the movie was they knocked off nearly 2 hours of that film, and it didn't really make much sense. I was still glad to have seen it. So yes, we kind of did a bit of shopping there, but it wasn't our major shopping thing as a whole. But I always noted it was a bustling town, a part of town. It was fascinating with Muslim shops, with colonial shops. There was that sort of a cultural kind of thing at the time. Was it safe in the 70s? Oh yes, it was. I think it was a very safe place. People told me how they used to walk Sundays looking at window shopping. Well, most places were closed in South Africa on Sundays or public holidays, certain public holidays. So people used to window shop just to pass the time, and and in a way, it was a good thing to do. You really got to feel where you lived, and it was kind of not a bad idea when you think about it. And definitely Wynberg was reasonably safe even at night. That changed when I started to work there. No, that's because I started to work there that things changed, but when I left at work around 8 at night, which was usually definitely once a week, sometimes twice a week I did that. And I would wait for the 8:30 Westlake bus, which is right opposite the bus stop was right opposite the Wynberg station by Portuguese fisheries. And it was a little seedy, but nothing ever happened to me there, but you got the feeling that things were changing and not for the better. On the main road, there were lots of ladies of the night. That's a kind of euphemism I'm using here. And of course, they're business managers, another euphemism. And they were growing in number. They were certainly growing in number at that time. But you could walk down Main Road at night in the 1980s. You could. The chance of you being mugged was, I'd say, 30% at most. Now it's about 95%. It's a chance of you getting mugged at night at Wynberg Main Road is about that. I think what I was experiencing was the beginning of the decline of Wynberg. From the library's point of view, it was a fascinating place because I was moved there from Metteridge, where I was very happy, and I didn't really want to move to Wynberg at all. I didn't want to move anywhere. I was so happy at Metteridge. But I'm afraid, that was it. I was told to go, so I went. And it was quite fascinating to notice the effect of apartheid on Wynberg. The area below the railway line only were allowed probably since only a year or two earlier to use that library, which is Becker's belief, but that's how it was in those days. And they were very bitter. Their little library, Castletown, on Castletown Road, I don't know where it was positioned, it must have been very small. And Wynberg Library was the premier library of the southern suburbs. At one time, I believe it was open on Saturday afternoons, even late. I remember seeing lights at the Wynberg Library passing by on Saturday night. When I mean night, about 8 o'clock or somewhere around that time. And that gives you some idea of how it was in those days. And there was a tension amongst members of the public from below the railway line. And the staff at Wynberg, I have to be directly honest about it, majority of them were very, how would you put it, I wouldn't say not even awkward, they dismissed it. They pretended it wasn't there, the problem wasn't there, but it was a big problem. And that's what I experienced, and it made me become a little more radical in my views. Noting people from down that side. I remember there was an activist. The Wynberg area had full of educated young people, and they generally took to politics because of their circumstances. It was quite understandable the way they did. Not necessarily, they were also highly idealistic, which when you look back on it, maybe they might have been a bit more cool, but it's easy to say coming from my position, but I think if you're in their position, you see it very differently. But I remembered one guy in particular. He was a very nice guy, and he was very passionate person, and he was involved in the underground, as it were. And the security branch, he told me, he didn't tell me, he told everyone up in the desk area. And he said, well, they brought in a parcel. It turned out to be a body of a family member. And I'm the only one that took note of it, because I think he was more or less addressing me rather than anyone else, because he kept looking at me, so I assumed that's what he was doing. And he told me that, now bury him, this kind of thing. And I was aware that when you get to a situation like that, you get aware, where am I, kind of thing, And I realized that, what was happening where I'm working. So I became very, argy-bargy because of some of the staff attitudes. It was very, I thought, insensitive, and to put it kindly. You could put it stronger than that, but it made me realize that what South Africa was really about. That's my view. Wynberg made me do that. It played a huge role. If you were UDF, you were a marked person. You had to worry about some of your own community too. And it was strange. And another strange thing, when I look back on it, even though I was aware and kind of sympathetic, I never walked through that area, fearing something might happen to me. In fact, I have friends in Plumstead who didn't know a street in that area. I mean, one of them got completely lost. It's simply because he's like scared something's going to happen. Afterwards, I've kind of laughed about this because it's laughable, but that's how it was, and you cannot say that it didn't happen. It clearly did. And Wynberg, from that side of Wynberg, was really going through quite something. It was, you could feel the tension. On the other side, there was moanings and groans of a different sort, and worried about the future. You got this sort of thing. The more educated, more professionals, which are much more concerned and not so disparaging about the other side of Wynberg. I noticed that. The ones who were not so, tend to be people that are not so well off, and that sounds a bit snobbish and snooty, but that was my impression. It kind of gave that feel. And Wynberg in those days was a tense place. in that regard, and Wynberg Library in particular took a bit of the brunt of this. We had a desk situation which was truly ridiculous, because we were literally surrounded by people, and if you've got people who have got grudges, they're not going to be polite. So they would fire a question, what you're dealing with someone in front, and they would fire a question from behind. So you were always going backwards and forwards, and it was very difficult to work there. And we were busy. That's another thing. We were extremely busy in those days, and it was a very, very interesting area, because there was a sizable Jewish community in those days. There was a shul, which is now a school, something of science over there. I remember the rabbi there, and I remember his daughter, because I was doing moonlighting at a bookstore, and his daughter was at that bookstore. So I kind of remembered pitched up on a Saturday, which is a no. So anyway, he was pretty cool about it. Got the stern, but okay, he doesn't know what he's doing kind of expression on his face, which is exactly was the case. Anyway, that community has all but disappeared, and that is very, very sad. They were very interesting people, some of them. I remember the dirtiest old couple you'll ever see, the Staines, and they claimed to be immigrants from Europe, from the Holocaust. They were not very sympathetic to what was happening on Crossroads. I remember we had a cardboard box full used clothes for the people at Crossroads, which was burning. You could see the fire, the smoke from the library. You could see it, and it was like really hectic down there. So the Staines, they took a disapproving view of this. So we'll not say further than that. But it just goes to show you how people can be, because they must have gone through. If they said they were, and I have a feeling that they probably did, then it just tells you a thing or two about people going through, traumas like that. They not necessarily turn out for the better. So, but I still remember them very well, because they were every time we opened the door, which I think was around 10 in the morning, they were there every day. And she was the louder one, and he was the quiet one, but they were both incredibly eccentric. So you always have a mental picture of them. I think that's one of the joys of being a librarian. If you work with the public, you get to meet people of this kind of nature. And I remember there was what was called a berchi, Sammy. And Sammy was a short little guy who came from the Northern Cape. And I remember him quite well. He was quite harmless. He used to always hang around the foyer. No, but he wasn't really a trouble or anything like that. So we had all kinds of characters and people that used to come in the library. It was fascinating. I remember there was a Russian in the days of the Soviet Union kind of thing. So this was quite unusual. He used to come to the library. There were various kind of. Our head librarian used to have some friends from South America, from Uruguay and Argentina, which was quite fun. There was a number of Uruguayans in particular I used to remember. I once went to one of their homes, invited me over. A very passionate thing. Wow, incredibly passionate thing. But so he used to come. So it had a kind of an international feel about it, and all people with various backgrounds that used to come there, because it was a big branch. It really was a big. We were the only library in the. This does not apply to the Cape Flats libraries, because Cape Flats libraries were always open on Wednesday afternoon, most of them. But in the southern suburbs, they were not. Wednesday afternoon was shopping day, going to the bank day, help the maid out day, that sort of thing. So it was nice, but I look back on those Wednesday afternoons. I go to see films or something. I'll visit a friend or something like that. It was great from that perspective. It was wonderful. But now but Wynberg didn't do that. Wynberg was open right through. I think to 8 o'clock. Yeah, it was open to 8 o'clock. So it was open till 10 to 8, 4 days of the week, and that was something. On Saturdays, we were supposed to be closed at 12. I noticed I said supposed to be, but it was often we were out by 12:30 because of the queues. There was queues, and that's one of the reasons why I think they had the number system. Each book that was released, there was a number, and heaven help you if the tray would fall, because there was no proper filing other than that number stamp, which was put onto the date sheet. I'm glad that came to an end, because that was a nightmare if that went wrong. So we used to get lots of queries, as you can imagine, because we were very busy, and it was yeah, sure. But Wynberg, as I say, during those days, and I said it was the beginning of its decline. I noticed it more during the night. When I was waiting for the bus. I'd get the bus at 8:30, and I'd be home in Takai, was where I was staying. I'd be home around 9. So, and you went round Medderidge and Bergfleet to get, that route. So that was not bad going. Unfortunately, the route, once I left, the route I think ended around about 1990, somewhere around then. So there was no Westlake bus. It would have been useful now. Westlake is now a very different place to when it was when I was staying in Takai. Very, very different place. It's a business park now. It would be very helpful now if there was a bus service there now, because now you're relying on a couple of taxi organisations that actually are not whose business practices are not exactly what I call pleasant. Anyway, but rather that's not the thing, but it just tells you that aspect of Wynberg at the time. It was very well connected. The railway station was safe at night. Drug addicts, hardly any. There were one or two. One of them is a notorious addict. I won't mention his name, but he's still around. But he was a minority in a sense, and you didn't see hardly any of them. They tended to go elsewhere, but Wynberg in those days was reasonably. But as I say, the prostitution thing, what was called the immorality mile, would go further down Wynberg. It usually was on the main road in Kenilworth, but it started to go further down the main road in Wynberg towards Plumstead into Deep River, and that's when one noticed that shops were beginning to close. The old shops were losing the arrival of malls put some of these shops into forcing them to close really, and there wasn't anything really replacing it. And around about 1990, then things started to change, like a lot of things in this country started to change rather rapidly, and not all of this changes were good, and for Wynberg it certainly hasn't been. Since I came back to work in 2011 here, one has to watch over one's back everywhere you walk around in the main road in Wynberg. We hear of borrowers coming to our library being attacked in the streets, quiet streets of Wynberg. Places like Coggle Road, you wouldn't expect that. The park is okay, but there's so many drug addicts and dealers and all over the place there. It leaves, if you take your family out, it leaves a bad taste, because they don't hide the fact. You see people now openly scoring with heroin, injecting heroin into their veins in dirty, grimy conditions. Police either they turn a blind eye, or they're just non-existent. It's the arrival of the foreign communities I want to be careful how I stress this, because it would be unfair on many of the foreigners who are trying to start a new life or create a life for themselves and are trying to do something useful. But there is one policeman told me the problem is undocumented illegals. This is where the problem lies, and they center around certain aspects of Wynberg, and there is crime bosses in the area that have made them a very powerful influence in Wynberg, and it's a completely negative influence. You can get any drug very easily in the open in Wynberg. It's because of this. There is also slumlords taking advantage of the foreign people who really too scared to go out and stay in Kailicha and places like that. So remember what happens when they chase these people out of places from out in the Cape Flats. So they ended up close to the main road, and Deep River, Plumstead, Wynberg suffered this. Wynberg suffered more than anywhere else. You could say a bit of retreat as well, and you can see Wynberg from this perspective of where it's gone into super decline. Now, this for those who want to feel about Wynberg and return to its glory, which I'm one of them. The thing is, it's inevitable in cities, places like Wynberg go through scenarios like this. It's a part, if you come from a city like London or Paris, you have the same thing. Parts of London have gone to wreck and ruin. But what happens is eventually, because the property becomes pretty cheaper, developers take an interest in it and then totally change it. Now that doesn't mean to say it would completely rechange the old days. I wouldn't be that naive. But it being grimy, I don't think will last forever. It probably will last at least another 10 years, I think. And then it might change that. I would love it to return it to what it was like. Could it? I'd say that's 50-50 on it. I don't think it's a no-hope case. I think there is enough people here. I remember speaking to a Muslim guy who was telling me, can you imagine this, how he must feel? He told me that that beautiful mosque by the station there, which to me is one of the most staggering buildings in the southern hemisphere. That's an exaggeration, but some suburbs. It is a beautiful building, and the smell of urine comes through the windows. Can you imagine? You're a pious Muslim. You've lived all your life in Wynberg. You went through the struggle. Can you imagine what that must be like? Wherever you are, that made a big impression on me, because thank you that you told me this, because it just put perfectly the outrage one feels about what's happened to Wynberg. And it's basically criminals that have done this to Wynberg. And a kind of lack of will perhaps on the authorities, but you could make a case for that. But chiefly because the criminals were able to operate almost without fear, certainly since 1990. I remember going in as an ordinary borrower to Wynberg Library, and I took a bus back, wanted to take a bus back, and I was confronted by this very rude taxi driver. And he virtually assaulted me, because I said, no, I'm not going to take you. Don't speak to people like this. I'm getting out of your taxi. And I said, no, this place is, I'm not going to this library anymore, because it's just not safe. And I told staff, no, I'm not going back. In the evening, it's just not safe. That was 2000. And so you can see the sense of this problem. It's been decades now that this problem has happened. Rivers Pharmacy has some old photographs of old Wynberg. I'm glad they keep that up. Well done to Rivets, because it shows what Wynberg used to be like. I I think when you get to the Wynberg Park area, it even gets more interesting because it becomes Bishop's Court when you go underneath the M3 and on Claessens Road. That's a beautiful area, that really is. That whole thing is, by the Wynberg Boys High, there's a magnificent colonial building over there, and a couple of others. The name just escapes me. Travata, an extraordinary building, which is a reflector of a different time, which is Boer War period, which I still think is the most important event that ever happened in South Africa. It was the Boer War, because everything influenced everything afterwards. So, and of course it affected Wynberg as well. Wynberg must have been in those days, must have been a real paradise place if you were up on the hill. And it must have been down here, with most of those beautiful buildings, a sense of real community down here. You must also remember, I'm kind of concerned about the Luxurama building, because the Luxurama should be a monument to what the apartheid era was about. The Quaibol brothers were a fascinating bunch. They owned both the Three Arts and Luxurama, and I think they owned other things as well. But those two and because they had to work in the parameters of which the apartheid, and it's a huge building actually, but it was the hub of that area. And then there's the William Herbert Sports Ground, and there's another sports ground on the other side, the Wynberg Club. And they were at different sides of the divide, in a sense of they sort of accepted being with the white sports, which was called I loathe that term, but that's how it was seen as. And Herbert was the Sakos one. Both should be. I do notice that the William Herbert one is looking better now, I'm very pleased to know that, because I think that's an important venue in my opinion, as is the other one. And I'm glad to see that they're looking reasonably okay. So that's very good news. So yeah, it shows it can be done. So I just want to cap off all this by saying that I'm glad I worked in Wynberg. I feel that I'm very loyal to this place. I know most streets of Wynberg without having to go to a street guide. So if anyone asks me, I more or less will know. So it's really much part of me. I would love to see the authorities do something about the main road and the terminus area. Now this big development is I think very crucial to the improvement of Wynberg. It depends how it goes. It could go either way. It could turn into a disaster, or it could be the start of rejuvenation. I like to think it is the latter. I think with a bit of positive and foresight, it could work that way. You're not going to please everybody. That's impossible. But it's a situation. If nothing happens, the people that have made Wynberg the way it is now will continue to influence and control this area, and that will be much of a future for children living here. It will be not pleasant. So it's that important that the memories of keeping Wynberg was, but to look towards a new Wynberg future, which would be a cohesive future, and not you over there and you over there and that sort of thing, because that is a recipe for disaster. And that's how I feel about Wynberg. It is a special place to me, and I'm approaching retirement. It would be nice if I could retire in Wynberg, but in a new Wynberg. But anyway, thanks for my time.